Yeah, okay pa ba yun? I think we have enough food already taken for today, right? Baka magkaroon tayo indigestion. But the previous speaker is talking about something with which I'd like to begin. And then I don't know if I can still add anything to what Brother Carl already told us. If you will forget my talk tonight, that's okay. But don't forget what he told us, and especially the advocacy that he is speaking about. You know. So you may or may not remember what I'm going to tell you about ethics, indigenous ethics, and the contemporary challenge. Actually, this is just an attempt at a report on ethics for the Filipino today. I am taking advantage of your invitation to make an attempt, even if only a preliminary one, to give a report on what I think is the state of ethics today, both globally as a philosophy and locally as an element of our culture. Let me start by risking to bore you with something I presume you already know. On a conventional note, let me begin with what every teacher of ethics, I think, should take up seriously with our students ahead of the other themes and issues people consider particularly engaging, timely, and relevant. So, boring though this might seem to you, let me start this lecture correctly, I think, by putting emphasis, first of all, on classical or traditional ethics, calling it frankly by name as the ethics mainly of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, thus Aristotelico-Thomistic ethics. To begin with, what is ethics? Conventionally, we define ethics as the quest for the good. It thus belongs to the practical side of philosophy, the other side being theoretical or speculative. What does this mean? The difference between theoretical and practical is rooted in our conception of man as a rational animal, which is among the most influential teachings handed down to us by the Greeks. It is the Greeks from whom we learned that man is a rational animal. A rational animal, and as an animal, man has senses, which in turn presupposes that he has body. An animal is thus a body equipped with the senses. Moreover, for these senses to work, the body must be alive. Such a living body is what we call an organism. So, man is an organism, a living body which has senses. This has to be stressed because not all bodies are organisms. Where am I? It's a trouble when you're reading. So man is an organism, a living body which has senses. This has to be stressed because not all bodies are organisms, meaning to say that not all bodies are alive. Wood and rock are equally physical, that is, they are bodies, but neither one of them is endowed with life. Such an inorganic or non-living body is what is described in general as a mineral, made, I suppose, of chemical compounds whose combination does not yet suffice to produce life. When so able to generate life, then it is already deemed to be more than a mineral. It is now a plant. This is the background to what Alasdair MacIntyre describes as Aristotle's ethics, based on what MacIntyre calls Aristotle's metaphysical biology. Seen in this light, man is already a complex entity. First, he is a body, but a body which has life, and so is not merely a mineral, but an organism. As an organism, he is a plant endowed with at least the minimum requirements of a living thing. We know a thing to be living if it is capable of self-movement, which neither rock nor wood can possibly do. At least from our commonsensical point of view, we imagine anything that happens to a rock or wood to be externally impelled, so that it will not move if not induced by, say, a strong wind or a strong object outside of it, say the arms of Hercules. A plant, meanwhile, moves by itself, that is, it nourishes itself, grows or wilts by itself, and multiplies itself for survival, if it is not to become an endangered species. An animal is an organism that has all that it takes to be a self-activating plant, but it has more. It is equipped with both external and internal senses. The external senses are 5 in all. We have eyes for seeing, ears for hearing, nose for smelling, tongue for tasting, and skin for touching. And the internal senses are likewise 5 in number: common sense, imagination, fantasy, sense memory, and estimative sense. With all or some of these senses, the animal is able to acquire knowledge, which we call sensitive cognition, following which is that kind of desire appropriate to an animal, which we refer to as sensitive appetite or sensitive appetition. Perhaps through evolution, a certain animal, maybe an ape, is able to give rise to a higher faculty. This constitutes a radical shift, which Darwin famously calls the origin of his species. Man is thus born in evolutionary time, and what makes him distinct from an animal is his power to think, his reason, the source of all our sciences, from physics to metaphysics. It is this human reason, the source of all the sciences, which is the source also of ethics and morality. The 2 words, incidentally, are in this paper taken practically synonymously. On the level of animals, we don't speak of morality, so that when havoc is made of a neighbor's garden by a dog, which we happen to own, most likely to earn the blame is not the dog, but we, its owner. The devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the last World War, even when caused by the split of the bombs over the land, was nonetheless attributed to the hands that dropped them. Morality came only with the emergence of man, and that because of his intelligence, his rational nature. Reason is a faculty unique to man. None of the minerals, plants, and animals has it, whether we view it in the light of classical cosmology or modernity's evolutionary biology. It is for this reason that man is a rational animal, animal rationale, and with thought comes the desire to know and to act on the basis of that knowledge. In other words, intellect and will. Both intellect and will are the same human reason aimed at different targets. The first aimed at the good, at the truth, and the latter at the good. Although a specific good must first be recognized before the will desires it. The fact is that we all naturally desire a general good, a good as such, whose nature we might not initially know, which is the target of our lifelong appetite or desire. This is why Augustine might have said at one time that his heart was restless and continuously was searching for something whose nature it did not know until he famously said it finally rested on God. According to classical ethics, it is the presence of both knowledge and desire, the interplay of the intellect and the will, which accounts for the moral value of a human act. A human act is an intelligent act, which we perform out of our free option, because as Augustine and Paul say, even if we know the good, it could be the evil which we might tend to do. It is thus the will which is free, not the intellect. The intellect is not free to distort the truth it sees, while the will has the option to do or not to do what it recognizes to be good. Thus far, the classical ethics of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. Though discussed rather too briefly, let's leave this ethics here for a while and see what went after Aristotle and the fall of Rome. Since the time was difficult, people became concerned with the meaning of life. The quest for good, especially the highest good or the summum bonum, was understandably acute. What is life for? In these dark times, what could be more natural than to long for and strive after happiness? There were therefore the hedonists who crudely desire physical pleasure, but there were also the Epicureans who had a more expanded view of happiness to include one's friends. And I was fascinated with the last question this afternoon about the others, the social factor in Tagay. Epicurus did not live, extravagantly. He lived on bread and water. How could we have inherited from him the word Epicurean, which usually is attributed to somebody who has a good taste for food? And the answer is because happiness is not really resident on the food. Happiness is resident on the fact that we share the food with each other. It doesn't really matter whether it's appetizing food, but it is shared among us, even if it's only tagay and mani, it's something that we treasure. It's a source of happiness. So Epicureanism. Thus, to Epicureans who had a more expanded view of happiness, they include one's friends. Friendship is the highest good. Indeed, as the biblical psalmist famously said, how good it is to live among friends. An even more subtle type of happiness, it will be recalled, has been bequeathed to us by Aristotle, who in the Nicomachean Ethics defined it as a state of mind which is coupled with virtue, citing virtue in light of that famous locus of it called the golden mean. So thanks to the last speaker here for developing this. This Aristotelian view of happiness was later adopted by Aquinas, who, given his context in the age of belief, objectified it even more to be equivalent at best to the state of spiritual bliss. This same state is arguably analogical to the bliss of Spinoza, which is why his monumental project is appropriately ranging from the most sensual to the most spiritual, between which is the secular conception of it by Aristotle called eudaimonian ethics. And in our time, the utilitarian ethics of Sage and Stuart Mill. Happiness, however, is only one major suggestion as to the nature of the summum bonum, which Aristotle explained as follows. Since every activity involving some acquired skill or some moral decision aims at some good, what do we take to be the end of politics? What is the supreme good attainable in our actions? Well, so far as the name goes, there is pretty general agreement. It is happiness, say both intellectuals and unsophisticated, meaning by happiness, living well or faring well, unquote. After Aristotle, during the difficult days of transition to the Middle Ages, there were, as we said, the Epicureans who found joy in the company of friends, the enduring type of which is the family, and today's religious communities. However, happiness continues to be a kind of mixed bag of a whole range of options which cannot have pleased everybody and remained unchallenged. The most serious challenge is posed during the post-Aristotelian times by the Stoics, for whom the highest good is virtue. Stoicism enjoins everyone to live according to nature, which requires discipline, since it entails the mastery of the passions of the body by the mind. This results in the image of a Stoic man as one unnerved by reverses of fortunes, so that, come good or bad winds, one remains unmoved. Apatheia is thus the iconic model of Stoicism, which literally means without pathos or feeling. This is, of course, not exactly accurate, because a person who has mastered himself, which is what a Stoic is, and whose reason has managed to control the tendencies of the body, need not be an uncaring person. Such a caricature of a stoic man does not exist. Though hardened by time, he indeed has attained such a mental posture as to enable him to withstand the turmoils of life. Nonetheless, he remains a man. All schools of ethics seem to be antinomically split between these two options of the summum bonum, namely either happiness or virtue. In their extreme form, they are what represent the popular classification of ethics into teleological and the ontological ethics, the former being goal or end-oriented, while the latter putting such a goal or end either aside or at least in a secondary position. The iconic examples of these are the utilitarianism of, say, John Stuart Mill, and then, of course, the so-called ontological ethics of Immanuel Kant. The quarrel begins when they're set completely against each other. Never mind if the utilitarians are struggling to reconceptualize utility in terms of what is in the interest of the greatest number. Or never mind if Kant is subtly qualifying his position by saying in no unambiguous terms that the highest good is a combination of happiness and virtue, where virtue stands for what makes one deserving of happiness. The recent emergence of what is called virtue theory arose out of the unease one rightly feels at the crude pleasure construed as the principle of virtue on the one hand and the perceived moral rigidity of Kant's categorical imperative on the other hand. MacIntyre's virtue ethics correctly aligns itself with Aristotle, but in doing so, it actually sides with the teleological principle of happiness as sufficiently defined by the philosopher himself to be a state of a mean between two extremes, which is exactly what is meant by virtue, or in other words, what is good. My reading of the literature surrounding virtue ethics might not be comprehensive enough, and so I acknowledge the need for me to read more of it. But I find its discussion so far lacking in that fundamental ground that could settle once and for all the meaning of virtue, otherwise also called the moral good. In Kant, at least, we are made to see the distinction between a practical or pragmatic good and a truly moral or virtuous good, the first emanating from what he technically describes as a hypothetical imperative, and the latter from a categorical imperative. You will need to pardon these technicalities of Kant to be able to decipher the simplicity of what he actually wants to say, but his time, demanded for no technical vocabulary effective enough than what we recognize now as the indispensable contribution to ethics of this formidable philosopher. So, what's the problem? Why do we still find so much evil, moral evil that is, in the world? No day passes without any news of criminal and corrupt behavior. Why so? Do we lack a science of ethics that would guarantee that we can discern the difference between good and evil? Alasdair MacIntyre famously opens his book with the following observation, and I quote, "The most striking feature of contemporary moral utterance is that so much of it used to express disagreements, and the most striking feature of the debates in which these disagreements are expressed is their interminable character. I do not mean by this just that such debates go on and on and on, although they do, but also that they apparently can find no terminus. There seems to be no rational way of securing moral agreement in our culture." That there seems to be no rational way of securing moral agreement in our culture seems to me indisputable. I contend, however, that this is not because of any lack of knowledge, even conviction about what is good. The classical principle of synderesis, do good and avoid evil, is hard to refute. Indeed, all indications point to the fact that this is acceptable by all. Moreover, startling though this position might be, I am hesitant to accept the contention that when anyone does an evil act, the evil quality of the act is not known by the actor. Especially in this day and age, we should have already perfected the intellectual mechanism whereby to judge whether our act or intended act is good or bad. My suspicion, nay, my contention, is that the matter has to do not with knowledge, but with factors other than knowledge. The intellect, says classical philosophy, knows the truth and is not at liberty to distort it. Indeed, if the person does not know the truth, he or she cannot be faulted completely for an act done out of ignorance. Thus, it is a question whether, from the practical point of view, there exists a truly invincible ignorance. Thus, I think that we now know that error in the case of an act is not due to the absence of knowledge. Everybody agrees, I think, that money is good, but everybody agrees likewise that stealing, especially if the victim is oneself, is a bad thing indeed. I know it when I get something from you wrongly, and so it is righteous that I am pricked in my conscience and feel remorse, whether or not I confess the guilt publicly. I cannot hide from myself the wrongness of an act I have performed, notwithstanding the fact that I do not feel the inclination to reveal openly my guilt. Knowledge is sure, but this has not prevented me from doing the crooked act myself. Even as I offer endless rationalizations, I know in the depth of me, even with no explicit formulated account, that I have done wrong and am bent to do it. What I am saying, in effect, is that there is no defect in our knowledge, and that we know whether what we are doing or intend to do is good or bad. If this is correct, then the question should be raised about where comes the error, if at all. I hope this position of mine no longer startles anyone, that evil is a question not of the intellect, whose business is knowledge or truth, but of the will, whose business is the good. This is the source of what emboldens Kant in the beginning of the groundwork of the metaphysic of moral, boldly to claim there is nothing in the world or outside of it that can be considered good without qualification except the good will. In the same breath, he is able to identify the factor that accounts for evil, a will that is not good, or if you wish, a bad will. That is the source of evil. The statement so elegantly formulated by Kant seems innocent enough, and yet it is actually an ethical bombshell. The statement is just as devastating ethically as the equally innocent statement, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? In the Critique of Pure Reason. Devastating theoretically. Anyway, Kant is not called the all-destroyer. He's called the all-destroyer by his contemporary Moses Mendelssohn for nothing. Let's get this clear. All that classical ethics tells us is that we know through our reason, acting as an intellect, whether what we do is good or bad. By our nature, then, we can know what's ethically correct. That we do evil is not so much because we do not know it to be wrong. Rather, we do wrong despite our knowledge. Corrupt officials are, of course, among the most intelligent among us, and know that plunder is a big betrayal of the people's trust. Yet how come they plunder anyway? In fact, the likelihood is that they enter politics precisely as a business enterprise in order to get the economic benefit of it. There must have intervened another factor, say the desire for wealth or power, which can prove stronger than the knowledge of what is good. The will that now weakens in the face of such a temptation of money or power now ceases to be pure. Such a state of mind is what changes the quality of the will from good to bad. Such a bad will, even when the action looks externally good, makes the action downright bad. Similarly, any act, if it appears bad, if it's coming from a good will, transforms it into an unequivocally good deed. There is nothing in the world or outside of it which can be considered good without any qualification except the good will. Anything at all, no matter how it appears to many people, if qualified by a good will, is in no uncertain terms good. And so the same act, if qualified by a bad will, is in equally certain terms evil. Thus, if MacIntyre is correct, that the Enlightenment philosophers share merely in the project of constructing valid arguments which will move from premises concerning human nature as they understand it to beat conclusions about the authority of moral rules and precepts, if the project is merely to translate one's knowledge to another knowledge, that is, from the knowledge of human nature to the knowledge of moral rules and precepts, then we can very well agree with him that any project of this form was bound to fail. Any such project is bound to fail, not only for the reason stated by MacIntyre, that these philosophers are inevitably going to come up with ineradicable discrepancies and divergences, but also because even should such discrepancies and divergences not occur, the defect lies not so much in its being a matter of knowledge as in its being a matter of desire, that is not in the intellect but in the will. Thus, if the objective of virtue ethics is the formation of the will, then I should say that its moral stance is indeed navigating the correct trail. However, if the education it undertakes equates with the entrancement of, say, specific principles, attitudes, and values in the children's mind, then chances are that, like the previous generations of teachers, the proponents of virtue ethics shall also fail to develop that sort of upright citizens who are of authentic moral worth. To me, Kant has correctly identified the goodwill as the groundwork of ethics. And so, its formation, the formation of the will, should be the correctly identified, should be the valid goal of ethics training. Nay, if Rousseau and Mencius are deemed to be correct, the goodwill is not so much to be formed as to be preserved. What sort of education should we design in order to guarantee the preservation of the goodwill? In any case, is the goodwill a fact or a myth? To Kant, the fact of the goodwill is inevitable, for it forms the basis, foundation, or as he puts it, the groundwork of a metaphysics of morals. We cannot repeat often enough the justly famous opening line of his groundwork: there is nothing in the world or outside of it which can be considered good without qualification except the goodwill. It would then be worth our effort to direct education in this manner, such that it results not so much in the formation as in the preservation of the goodwill. This would exactly be the equivalent of Mencius' injunction that we return to nature, because nature is good. Let's explain this further. MacIntyre's diagnosis of the Enlightenment project, that it had to fail, is correct. There is only one way for enlightenment to attain its telos, and that is by going beyond itself, by realizing the futility of its own epistemological project, a predicament very similar to the Hindu experience of neti-neti, as it rationally tries to understand Brahman. Neti-neti, not this, not that. What is Brahman, not this. Whatever you can say, whatever you say of Brahman, Brahman is not that, not this. All such efforts to disclose the nature of Brahman, taken either singly or collectively, are bound to fail, inasmuch as using Bergson, they are all too narrow, above all too rigid for what we try to put into them. The best illustration of this remains to be, for example, Kant's all-devastating critique of pure reason. The very formulation of the critical project, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible, actually amounts to the shaking of the foundations of all the sciences, nay, of all knowledge. To me, Kant's critique of pure reason is the culmination and perfection of the Cartesian universal doubt, whose first principle continues to reverberate. In order to examine into the truth, it is necessary once in one's life to doubt of all things so far as this is possible. Without diminishing the importance of Descartes as the father of modernity, his universal doubt turns out to be anything but final and universal. For the succeeding triumvirate of empiricism, John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume, have yet to continue the historical task of refining to perfection the Cartesian method of doubt. Descartes, it turns out, failed to doubt three key concepts. Innatism, which Locke demolished in the first book of the essay concerning human understanding. Matter of substance, which Berkeley exploded in the three dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, and cause or causality, which Hume masterfully exposed in an inquiry concerning human understanding. It is Hume who famously woke up Kant from his dogmatic slumber, without which one might surmise that the critique of pure reason could not have been written. The entire formidable first part on the elements of transcendentalism, which constitute practically the entire first critique, is tantamount to a sweeping job of demolition of the entire classical architectonic, leaving nothing of it still standing. With the critique of pure reason, the entire history of Western philosophy that started with the Greeks, which Martin Heidegger called the first beginning, has thoroughly collapsed. With Kant, the radical threshold has been crossed, and the transition to postmodernity, Heidegger's second beginning, takes in its initial steps. The entire methodological endeavor from Descartes to Kant, a stretch of some 3 centuries, which is called modernity, the Age of Enlightenment, is the crucial period of transition from the classical age to the post-classical, post-rational, post-enlightenment age brought about by the great paradigm shift, Heidegger's second beginning. As already mentioned, MacIntyre considered this as the total failure of the Enlightenment project. This, however, is only an attitude one may take of this historical event. Heidegger seems not to consider it as a total failure. On the contrary, like Nietzsche, he welcomes it as the dawn of a new beginning, a prelude to the future. The difference is exemplified by MacIntyre's return to Aristotle, indicating his failure to experience the radical step onto the new beginning, as did Heidegger. This event entails a paradigm shift in all spheres of life, including ethics. I beg your indulgence that I will not go back to the metaphysics, that I will now go back to the metaphysics of being and time. In effect, what Heidegger is trying to say in this monumental work is that while the Greeks were able to articulate the correct question, they were not able to answer it adequately, except for the truly primordial thinkers like Anaximander, Heraclitus, and Parmenides. Plato and Aristotle in particular are singled out as culprits in the eventual historical destruction, D-I-S-T-R-A, destruction, that result in humanity's forgetfulness of being. The rest of history is thus a history of forgetfulness. And what it calls metaphysics is really only physics. When in the Metaphysica, Aristotle states, after a lot of beating about the bush, that being is substance, what he actually affects is seal, at least for the next 2 millennia, the destiny of the West, characterized now by the sophistication of technique through science and technology. This is all fine, for as long as we are willing to accept the required sacrifice of the original metaphysical or ontological project, which could have continued unceasingly if we did not experience the limits of growth and progress at the turn of the millennium. Despite amazing advance in the disciplines of science, poverty goes on unabated globally, carrying with it altered forms of social slavery and injustice. It remains a question whether the calculus of human misery has actually tapered down, given the massive experience of need and want amidst progress and plenty. Add to this the monstrous natural disasters and global warming, rather anticipated than controlled precisely as a consequence of the growth of technical sophistication. Then we have the picture of an Earth fearful of explosion and annihilation. Wars and rumors of wars are getting to be even more nervous on account of threats of chemical and nuclear weaponry. No wonder we continue to hanker after peace, even as we try to reduce seemingly hopelessly all prevailing social inequalities. It is about time that we begin anew, indeed, says Heidegger. We have already taken the crucial step towards a new beginning, which is tantamount to a radical shift of paradigms. If you allow me to translate what Heidegger is trying to tell us, I'd say that time is now right to already take a grip of that initial impulse of being, which was still so alive in Anaximander, Heraclitus, and Parmenides. The new beginning is the authentic ontological age, which should define the next millennium or two, marked by the emergence of the true metaphysics after 2 millennia of forgetfulness. But you'd say, this is metaphysics all over again, whereas the new age should be characterized by a climate described by Levinas as otherwise than being. Despite his formulation of it, Levinasian ethics presupposes, in fact, Heidegger's ontology. They actually constitute the proverbial two faces of the same coin. If indeed ours is a new beginning, it cannot anymore be like before, oblivious of being, inauthentic, in other words. It thus presupposes a radically new human reality. Call it, as Heidegger does, Dasein, or as Nietzsche does, Übermensch. Or you may invent your own name for this new and higher species of humanity. To Confucius, for example, this is the man of Ren, the great man. This transformed human type is ontologically different from the outdated rational animal of old. For one, it is ethical in its very core, precisely because it is characterized by authenticity. Dasein as Übermensch, Übermensch as Dasein does not only seem good, he or she is good. This is the very essence of the newly evolved higher species of human reality, summed up by the word authenticity. If this is not what to be ethical means, I don't know what is. Now let us consider what this term good means. It certainly does not refer to mere compliance with norms, principles, injunctions, rules, and other such general presuppositions scientifically induced and organized by certain philosophies, thought systems, faiths, or ideologies. Such a practice would suit the period of modernity at the conclusion of the classical age, and so before the paradigm shift of the new beginning. This is what Lyotard means when, as a result of a commissioned work, he concluded that the age of postmodernity is basically against all meta-narratives. The postmodern age is also a post-ideological age, no matter whether the ideology is political, intellectual, social, or religious. Such an attitude of compliance makes for what MacIntyre calls a theater of illusions. All modes of thought are creatures of habit, including our concept of, say, human rights, very popular today. Even that concept of human rights is a product of thought, creature of habit. It is therefore not true that only the civil society's version of it has the right to prevail. Here is where Nietzsche got it right, that all tables of good and evil cannot be said to be permanently fixed. That it is in their very nature that at certain times these tables have to be turned and all values reevaluated. The actual locus of all these concepts and values is our collective intelligence. They're historically and culturally evolved and deposited. Nothing then is sacrosanct. This fact of the transitoriness of all norms and standards, all concepts of right and wrong, of good and bad, should not be allowed to go into oblivion. Otherwise, we experience again and again the shackles that bind our acts, that make us slaves despite our natural state of freedom. Once liberated from this conceptual and moral baggage, we start getting in touch again with our original state, what Kant calls our goodwill, which is what Rousseau refers to as the general will. It is this will which Rousseau says never errs, the only thing, says Kant, which is always good without qualification. This is the groundwork, the fundamental principle of ethics. All tables of good and evil rely on it for their moral quality, so that an act which is otherwise good becomes downright bad when qualified by and grounded on a bad will. The goodwill may be likened to the Cartesian Coquito as the residue that remains after the universal doubt. However, it should be kept in mind that this residue has already undergone no small historical refinement, so that by the time it was received by Husserl, this pure consciousness is no longer solitarily floating in mid-air, but ceaselessly aware that it is always consciousness of something. The better for Heidegger to bring it to a new niveau where it is no mere pure consciousness, but already Dasein, a being in the world. Dasein is being in the world. What is construed as the triumph of subjectivity must now be taken to mean the emergence, or, as Darwin would have it, the origin of a newly evolved and higher species, which for now we'll call Dasein. Its appearance marks, too, the dawn of a new morality, described by Nietzsche as one appropriate of masters rather than slaves. You will pardon the rather dramatic turn of his phrase, which, however, makes perfect sense insofar as we are experiencing just yet the beginning of an epoch, perhaps the beginning of at least the next 3 millennia. What is this new morality? If I were to review our existing moral theories, I would consider Alasdair MacIntyre's virtue ethics as the most recently articulated theory, preceded only by the deontological ethics of Kant and the teleological ethics of utilitarianism, say of John Stuart Mill. Others not to be missed should include Joseph Fletcher's situation ethics and Max Scheler's phenomenologically considered value ethics. To me, the theory of justice of John Rawls and the social ethics underlying the thought of Amartya Sen make a lot of profound impression. The antinomian perspective one gets by taking a broad view of Epicureanism and Stoicism cannot be taken for granted. And in all likelihood, all these and others not explicitly mentioned here redound at bottom to that great divide between Plato and Aristotle. There could be many other thinkers and schools of thinkers on a pupil's notepad, and they will probably make distinctive sense in their own peculiar way. So we shall reject none of them. We shall reject none of them and allow them all to fall in line in the manner of Bacon's theatrical celebrities. But also like Bacon, we shall try to rid ourselves of all of them so as to be able to see things as they are. Nay, we shall not ruthlessly rid ourselves of them, whose possibility is in question, but merely suspend them in the manner of Husserl's epoche, or better yet, as appropriated by a truly hermeneutic consciousness, as suggested by Gadamer. The popular Steve Jobs and Warren Buffett recently made Yahoo News by declaring that whoever is eyeing success needs to focus. And such a focus requires not so much a yes, 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 but a no, no, no. That sounds very much like Jiddu Krishnamurti's formula for radical freedom, except that there lurks a danger that our no might be selectively designed to aim at the survival of a specific position, which is not what we are meaning to say here. Our no is closer to the Vedantist neti, or Kant's all-devastating critique of pure reason, as well as today's radical deconstruction and rejection of all types of meta-narratives. In fact, McIntyre's virtue ethics narrowly misses this ideal of, or radically, McIntyre's virtue ethics narrowly misses this ideal or radical nihilism by inevitably choosing to take up the cause for Aristotle. This is similar to the case of Joseph Marechal, whose transcendental Thomism falls by a hairbreadth to take a complete turn from classical to postmodern theology, giving them the honor of the crucial move to Karl Rahner. All theoretical positions, including those of ethics, invite dissent and thus sustain the state of war, which for Hobbes constitutes the nature of man. The original state of innocence and freedom is a pre-ethical state which we can only imagine but not empirically prove. Such original goodness of man stimulates our poetic inclination and produces the mythological spirit seemingly present in the prehistory of every group of people. Heidegger invites us to penetrate the Ursprung, which in his second landmark work after Sein und Zeit he calls Ereignis. Ereignis is a new consciousness, evolved through at least 3 millennia of earnest thinking by the West, which brought forth this amazing age of science and technology, now on the way to its 4th industrial revolution. Either that, where the machine designed by man develops through countless human strategies and innovations into a new species in its own right, in which case the robot becomes an ultra-robot with a super mind of its own, better than any man can ever have, or man himself will be a newly evolved species, no longer simply a rational animal, thus no longer merely a man, but perhaps what Nietzsche calls Übermensch, or what Heidegger calls Dasein. Dasein is thus a radically new species in the hierarchy of beings. It is, Nietzsche says, the meaning of the earth. The Dasein is no more theoretical construct on the part of the great philosopher. It is, if it were, it should have to be dropped and rejected as just one of the many other theoretical positions that parade on Bacon's stage. One of those theoretical standpoints that need to be abstained from and bracketed through Husserl's phenomenology. One more name or form which the Hindu sage will have to say no to. Never mind the name, because the point is to experience it, referred to and given various labels by men of all times and climes, such as Nirvana by the Buddha, Nirguna Brahman by the Vedantists, the cloud of unknowing by the unknown mystical writer, the sage in Socrates which knows that he does not know, the radical via negativa one encounters in all great philosophies and theologies. What Levinas calls infinity, that which Kant refers to as the known root of all knowledge, here given by Heidegger the name of Ereignis. So long as these are not turned into theoretical constructs, then they point to that ground zero of all ethics, called by Kant the Goodwill. Even the most savage of all human creatures are equipped with this pure and noble will. Yes, even when one is impelled by one's culture or social circumstances to pick up a weapon and kill. This is where I would like to connect with the contemporary events in our country's history. It is really on condition that he is coming from the goodwill, here better cited as the general will, that one can justify even the cases of EJK purportedly committed by President Rodrigo Duterte. Indeed, all seemingly incomprehensible acts and decisions of the current administration cannot make sense on this assumption. The other option is to keep to the old vocabularies and meanings of terms such as human right, presidential statesmanship, diplomacy, and others. In short, the classical meaning of right and wrong, good and evil. Personally, I wouldn't go for this other option because we have already been here for an incalculably long period of time. And aren't we already sick and tired of it? When it comes to such matters as current to us, I can only take my stance without claiming complete knowledge of how things really stand. This is where a lot of prayer is needed, for we are left with only a whiff of hope and trust to keep ourselves going. There are a lot more to say, and I do not expect to have satisfied all of your curious questions and queries. You might, however, be asking about the place of indigenous ethics in all this. Before I accepted the invitation of Mr. Aldrin Quintero and Mr. Randolph Puntilla, I frankly confess to them that I have the least expertise when it comes to our minority brothers and sisters. In the end, after our online conversation, I agreed, albeit meekly and not unreservedly, to their request. I feel for that noble savage, which is also alive in my inmost self. And in no case should that be violated by everyone. When I was listening to Brother Carl, there was nothing I disagree with. It seems I completely agree with him. Disconnects. Of course, the way I'm proposing it or approaching it is very much different from the way Brother did it. He's the more practical one. Mine is the more philosophical one. He's coming from here. I'm coming from philosophy. All that should, in the last 3 millennia of existence of the rational animal, we have been besieged by all sorts of principles, rules, and theories, which have become instruments of various forms of degradation and dehumanization. All that should go now, for it is now time to evolve that new consciousness that transcends all prescribed limits. We have coined varied names for it: compassion, love, justice, benevolence, charity, generosity, authenticity. Equipped, says Pascal, with a heart that contains a reason which reason itself does not know. Once called to life, not as a theoretical construct, an ideological imperative, or a religious dogma, but as a living reality that essentially defines us, there shall be no more moral or ethical problem left to haunt us, and the dream of eternal peace shall already have become